Welcome back, guys. I want to cover a big hot topic on this, and everyone that owns this car, or even has a friend or knows someone that does, or just even keeps up with trends, is that this FA24D has oil pressure drops. And under very specific circumstances on track, when you're on a high G load at higher RPMs. So there are a few things I want to cover that actually help mitigate that. So I want to cover 7 main things that actually help mitigate this problem so that you can actually track your car with a little bit more peace of mind. Now, there's a few other people that I've compiled data and I've got some knowledge from that they've been doing it since 2022, and they've been going strong on the same block, and they are mitigating oil pressure. Now, there is a big clue as to how much oil pressure is too little. Well, to be honest, we don't really know yet. But from the people that have been doing it, they've eliminated enough to where they can still keep on going. I want to give a shout out quickly to 900 BRZ, and 6 Auto, and Driver's Paddock. With those guys, their combined effort of collecting track data continuously has been providing pretty good feedback and actual data that they're actually pulling from their CAN bus from the car, and they're getting live actual data. So I suggest if you want to learn more about that, you want to actually see actual track footage, go ahead and visit their pages, and I'm going to put a link down below so that you guys can check out those videos. I think it's very knowledgeable and good information to see. Now also, I want to thank GR Cup. Now, GR Cup, if you're not familiar, is a series that actually races these GR86s and BRZs, and typically they started around that time when this car was released in 22, and they are limited to using the factory block. So it has to be a factory sealed block from Subaru, and they cannot tamper with the internals. What they can do is throw a bunch of track supporting mods on it, which is typically cooling. Once they do that, they've been going on strong as well. I'll get into those details later. Number one, I want to start with oil viscosity. So everybody knows where you can check your oil. You know where your oil filter is, and I'm pretty sure if you've done some basic mechanics, you've changed your own oil. Now, oil viscosity is a big deal, especially when you come to tracking this. So a way you can help mitigate this with oil is actually choosing a different viscosity. Now, the factory, as we all know, is 0.820. Everyone is recommending, especially if you're going to drive it hard, not just from data that's proven, but also from Subaru manufacturer manuals, they actually state that a 40 weight oil is actually necessary when you're driving the car in these, you can say, abusive circumstances or extreme circumstances, to where you're going out to the track, for example, 20-minute sessions, constantly going to red line. That's considered an extreme circumstance. So why should you go to a 40 weight? Well, one of the major reasons is it helps mitigate oil pressure. They've noticed that the higher viscosity oils actually limit to how low the oil pressure actually drops. So with the 0.20 weight, you're going to see a lot more of a bigger dip in oil pressure versus a 30 weight versus a 40 weight. So the higher the viscosity, the less the dip is. Now, it doesn't fix the problem by itself, but it definitely adds in helping to mitigate that. Now, another part of it too has to do with temperature. Now, a 20 weight oil, if you're running this on the track, at some point right after 220 degrees Fahrenheit, this will actually taper and lose viscosity. You'll actually drop from a 20 weight to a 10 weight once you surpass that 220 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the other benefit of having a higher viscosity oil, running a 40 weight oil, will actually push those temps a little higher to where that taper of viscosity happens. Now, like I mentioned, a 20 weight tapers sometime after 220 degrees Fahrenheit. A 40 weight, now there is a formula to this. You can do some math and some science and apply it, but I don't want to complicate it too much. I think you guys can understand the theory without having to do formula and looking at graphs and such. But I'm going to give you a general idea as how much it actually bumps it up. Now, with a 40 weight, you're looking at tapering about, let's just say, 250 degrees or up. Now, it's very rough. It's not a solid number. It's just a rough estimate. And that just gives you an idea of why tapering is an issue when you have a thin oil, is because when you drop below the recommended viscosity, you can actually cause some damage when you're in those extreme circumstances, constantly running it to redline, and definitely at 20-minute sessions. So the 40 weight oil will actually help save your engine in those extreme temperatures, and you get a wider band of your operating temperature of where you can operate safely. All right, number 2, oil level. Now we all know where the dipstick is, and I'm pretty sure you've checked your oil dipstick and seen the level when you've done your own oil change or have taken it to get oil changed. So a lot of people have talked about overfill. Now some do it a quarter of a quart, half a quart, 3/4 of a quart, a full quart. Now we know that this engine in particular takes about 5 quarts, maybe 5.3, including the oil filter. And so 0.7 is a nice round number if you have a total of 6 quarts. Now, 1 quart for everyday use, again, totally fine. Doesn't matter where that range is. You can put in half a quart, 0.7, a full quart. It won't hurt you. But in the track setting, if you do overfill a little too much, there have been people that claimed that when you're driving it hard, again, in those 20-minute sessions, constantly going to redline, you once you're done with your session, turn the car off, and then you go back to drive the car. Under startup, you'll see white smoke come out your exhaust pipe. Now, people get concerned and startled, and they're like, well, what's going on? Did I blow my engine? It's actually just burning some oil off. And what that is from oil coming from your crankcase, your PCV valve connects to your intake manifold, which is this guy right here. So this PCV valve is getting oil coming up into your intake, and that dumps that oil into your intake, going into your engine, and it'll burn it off. And that's why that smoke happens. Now, if you don't want that to happen, drop that number down, 0.7 to half. Now again, that's under track settings. The other reason for overfilling is because now this is a flat engine, right? We all know this is a boxer engine, but this is also considered an open deck, meaning that the oil from the oil sump, the oil pan, can actually come up and then spill outwards. So it's doing this type of thing. Now, if you're doing high G loads, high G turns, high speed, and you're driving on the track, this is what your oil is doing. Now, that contributes to the oil pressure drops because oil is leaving the oil sump, and it's leaving little to no oil around your pickup. Now, that's the problem we're trying to avoid. We do not want that pickup from your oil pump to pick up no oil. That's contributing to the oil pressure drops. So the overfill, again, alone by itself doesn't eliminate that problem, but the overfill helps keep some oil a little bit more than what you would have at stock level, rather than having no oil. So it just gives you a little bit added benefit just to having that overfill. All right, next thing, oil baffling. Now, all this is really sheets of metal. It was designed in such a way to allow some oil to come back in, but it's mainly used to prevent oil from surpassing the point of the upper block, or the lower block, I should say. So really, it helps keep and maintain oil in your oil pan. Now, it again helps mitigate it. It doesn't eliminate it by itself, but as you compile these parts and compile these tips together, all these things help, and they work in unison to help alleviate how much that oil pressure dips. Now, that's also a very inexpensive mod and fix, and honestly, if you're going to drop your oil pan anyway, you might as well invest the couple $100 that it might be, and just have it installed while you're cleaning out the RTV, especially if you're going to consider autocross or even track settings, or drifting for that matter. It's another peace of mind. It's not too expensive, and since you're there, you might as well get it done. Some of you may not know where the oil cooler goes. Some of you are familiar. Typically, you're going to see it right behind the grill here. And the reason you route the oil cooler. Here is for airflow. If you're not familiar, there is a grill here. Now, obvious reasons you get airflow there. Now, how does that help mitigate oil drops? Is that one, for an added benefit, is by stabilizing your oil temperatures at speed, on track setting, you're actually keeping the oil pressure drops mitigated. Now, oil pressure drops are actually directly related to temperatures, because the thinner the oil gets, the hotter it gets, the less oil pressure you have. So if you can keep your cooler there and maintain it at a track range, optimal temperature is where they want it to keep you, you can have a little bit more control of your oil pressure. The other added benefit to running an oil cooler is that you can actually get a system in full. It actually adds an additional quart to your overall oil system. So adding an additional oil, 1 quart to your system, so going from your 5 to a 6, is an added benefit, because now you have a little bit more oil that can handle a little bit more abuse of longevity, because instead of breaking down the 5 quarts, you have 1 more added quart that it has to go through to try and break down. That's also 1 more added quart that helps cool your system. And then on top of the overfill, you can essentially have somewhere between 6.25 to even 7 quarts completely in your whole oil system. So all of these things help kind of contribute to, one, maintaining oil temperature, and then also helping to mitigate those oil pressure drops. Now, there's one part I wanted to mention as well. When you do the oil cooler mod, when you add this in, now see this guy right here? This is the factory heat exchanger. There have been guys that have removed this and just put the sandwich plate in its place. The reason for that is because this little heat exchanger actually restricts oil flow. In this situation with this car, that resistance can actually add temperatures. So you want to take away as much, anything that can cause the temperatures to rise, you want to eliminate that, especially when we know that temperatures are related to the oil pressure drops. So replace that, add a sandwich when you add your oil cooler kit. This one's going aftermarket, and if you're not familiar with an Accusump, think of the Accusump as an added reservoir, and it typically sits right about here. Now, there are many different sizes of Accusump you can get, or an added reservoir of oil. Now, it can be half a quart, it can be many quarts. Now, the one that I've seen from Ansix in particular has actually ran a 2-quart system. So you can imagine if you have an additional 2 quarts that sit up here, the additional 2 quarts that sit up here, now the purpose of that is to have extra oil when your oil pressure is dropping. And we all know when your pressure drops, like I mentioned, you're losing oil from your oil pan. This Accusump, based on vacuum, will actually pull oil into your oil pan down at the bottom of the block as it's losing oil pressure. So that will help mitigate oil pressure drops by, one, having a backup set of oil rushing down there so that your pickup doesn't actually pick up air. And then in those moments, now as you watch other videos, those oil pressure drops happen. It could be a fraction of a second, it could even be maybe a whole 1 or 2 seconds, but at most, that's most extreme. But think of it as you're going into a wide sweeping turn. How many seconds could that be that you're entering red line and holding that for the whole turn? So for however long you need that additional oil sump, that Accusump will dump the oil in there, keep the oil flowing through your engine and circulating, so that once you're stabilized again and you're no longer in that turn, that additional oil, once it fills up into the pan, will come back into the Accusump, and it'll remain there for the next turn and the next turn, and so on and so forth. So that's how an Accusump works. It's actually a fairly inexpensive alternative, and you can get the kit, and most shops should be able to install that for you, or you can even do that yourself if you're a little bit handy. Now, that is one way. Another way to help mitigate. It doesn't solve the problem altogether. It's just one additional thing that you can add to help alleviate the situation. The next thing I want to mention is RTV. Now, RTV is and is not an issue. It is because why do we need extra RTV in the oil pan? We don't need that. But when I say that it's not an issue, because there hasn't been any direct concern or cause of engine failure from too much RTV. So you can still drive your car every day, and you can still even go to the track, and you still haven't dropped your pan and won't really see any issues. But if you want to keep maximum flow of oil, you want to make sure that everything is as clean as it's got to be, especially if you're going to drop the pan and do an oil baffling system. Why not? You might as well do that. So it doesn't hurt. It's just one more peace of mind for you. Lastly, I want to mention there's been some prototype pans that are being designed, and there's one in particular I want to shout out as Verus Engineering, and actually some other guys along with 900 BRZ have been assisting in running prototype oil pans for this particular FA24D, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they're up to prototype number 3, and this one seems really promising because it, with all the data that's accumulated together, like I mentioned, all of these single-handed tips and additions and mods won't alleviate and won't get rid of the oil starvation, the oil dip, the oil pressure drop by itself, but accumulatively, all of these things will contribute to it. But based on design, based on the oops that Subaru have done with this particular engine, knowing that those high-speed turns, those high G loads will actually drop oil pressure, what they really needed was a bigger oil pan. Now, if you're into cars and you know that Porsches also run boxer engines, and you're wondering, well, do Porsches run into this issue? They don't. The major reason is because they actually run an external oil pump, which is also known as a dry sump oil pump. This dry sump oil pump runs separate, independent from the engine, so it's not driven by the engine crank, it's actually typically electric. This dry sump oil pump can create oil pressure and hold oil pressure at whatever RPM that you want it to. So especially these high-end Porsches, whether it's a GT anything or a 911, they all have their boxer engine, they all make 300 plus horsepower, and they're all spinning to 8,000 RPM, 9,000 RPM. Some of those, they will always have oil pressure no matter what. So now granted, it is Porsche, it's an expensive brand, but they've been around for over a century, and they have many decades of racing R&D. And it's a Porsche, so you're going to pay Porsche money. This car was meant to be a budget sports car that everybody can afford. Obviously, they did the best they could with the budget that they could to design this car, but again, Subaru made an oops, and they didn't foresee that oil pressure drop under high G loads at high RPM. So you gotta give them a little slack, but now because of that, it's left to the consumer to figure out the situation. So Verus is actually working on this, and I'm hoping sometime this year they will have a pan that's readily available for the public to buy. They're another group that I'm going to add into the comments down below. You go ahead and check them out. They're a shop out in the Midwest, and Midwest or East Coast. They do some really cool stuff, and not just for this platform. They work on other cars as well. So they do a lot of track-oriented stuff. Go ahead and check them out as well. Go ahead and check out that oil pan, like I mentioned, because that's something that's worth looking into, especially if you want to track your car, whether it's, again, autocross, road racing, drifting. I think that oil pan is essentially, based on everything I've seen, could be the solution to this oil pressure drop situation. I mentioned that GR Cup runs factory sealed engines, right? So they do not open up the block, they do not modify anything. And all they can do, though, what they can do is add cooling mods. Now, it's a stock engine, right? So how did they help mitigate that? They've done a few things with GR Cup. They've also designed their own baffling system for the oil pan, and they've done a few other things to help mitigate that, very similar to what I've mentioned. Now, they are all designed and spec'd to be race cars. So to give you an idea of how they need to run, on a given weekend at a racetrack, they'll do a practice run that's 30 minutes long. Then they'll have a second practice run. That's another 30 minutes long. And then they qualify for 15 minutes. Then they race for 45 minutes. Then they qualify again for 15 minutes. Then they have a second race for another 45 minutes. That's a total of 3 hours of running this engine. Can you imagine 3 hours in a weekend of constant abuse of this engine? They had to figure out a solution for that oil pressure drop, which they did. And thanks to them, you imagine there's 21 hours per car in a given season in a full year. Now again, factory sealed engine, they cannot modify the internals, but they can get to the oil pan, they can do other cooling mods, they can do things like that. So as far as built engine, this is factory built that they're running, but they've proven that this engine can be ran on the track, can be done safely. As long as you take certain precautions to help mitigate these oil pressure drops, it is possible. So that's why I want to cover all of these tips of how to go about it. If you do want to track your car, there are ways to help mitigate it and to do it safely to where you have more peace of mind versus doing nothing with it and just sending it. So hopefully this helps you, give you an idea of what's going on. Now, if I did miss anything, I'm hoping that we can just add on to this, so throw it in the comments. I want to learn because I love learning as much as I can about this, especially I personally want to track this car, and I'm going to run 8.6 Cup in their stock class, so I'm not looking to modify this like crazy and add a bunch of power, but again, I do want it to do it safely, and there are track supporting mods that almost every car needs to do regardless of what car it is. So this is just one more thing with this unique boxer engine. It's just one little thing you got to take care of. Other than that, I think this is a wonderful platform. So if you had any hesitation to going with this, hopefully it helps you to solidify your decision in making this purchase. I think it's a great purchase. I think for what it is, a new car of today that you can buy that's still around $30,000 or less, you still get a great sports car that gives you great feedback, and honestly, you can't beat it for what you get for a new car. So if you like this, I'm going to continue to do stuff like this because one, I like the knowledge, and two, I want to share it with you guys. And please let me know if there's anything that I did miss or you want to add on to it. Let me know, because I want the community as a whole to benefit from this. So thank you for watching. I'll talk to you guys next time.